Hello, good morning. Hello, good morning. Yes, we like call and response. My name is Malika Pryor, and I serve as the Chief Learning and Engagement Officer for the International African American Museum. And I don't usually describe what I do, but it's a little bit relevant to the presentation today and sort of justifies why I'm here before you as opposed to any of my other incredibly capable, articulate, and talented team members. So my team, or within my team, lives all of what I think about, and you'll see this term mentioned a little bit later, our mission animating departments. So we are a division of 7 unique teams, 6 departments that include everything from exhibitions to community relations. And the journey for the development as a project and a concept into the opening of the International African American Museum is one that was 23 years in the making, but we're in fact just a little bit over a year and a half old. And I think there's a video that's supposed to play. Okay, that'll give you a sense of that beginning.
The waters touching the shores here are the same waters that connect us back to Africa. The same waters which carried our ancestors' hopes and dreams.
This museum that we opened today is a gift to our country, and it is a gift to each of us and to future generations.
One of our stories is a resistance story. Black people who were free thinking and free moving and 8 times greater in number were the greatest threat to South Carolina in 1740. The wanted posters called them bandits and outlandish Negroes. The woods was full of them. They met up in the wilderness, hid in the hinterlands, deep in the cane and the blackberry, undiscovered but hunted, had children, built settlements, kept watch. Their lives had been stolen, but it was still their life to live. Anointed people. But yeah, they were the people who had the strength, always, rise up, never be free.
To know the price of this privilege is to honor a human story, a people's story, my nation's story, the story of one of the most incredible journeys of all time, the African American story. Welcome to the International African American Museum.
So that was opening day, June 27th, 2023. And since then, we've been pretty busy doing the work of offering no less than 11 core exhibitions and now preparing to open the 6th and final special exhibition in our opening season. But I just want to provide a little bit of context for the grounds on which the International African American Museum was constructed or is constructed. Has anybody ever heard of Gadsden's Wharf? Okay, I see a few hands. So at the time of the completion of its construction in the late 1770s or middle 1770s, Gadsden's was arguably the largest wharf of its kind in North America and certainly the largest in the business of the transatlantic slave trade. Between the years 1807 and 1808, the final years of the transatlantic slave trade being legal in the United States, Gadsden would become the sole purveyor in the business on behalf of the city of Charleston. So we consider these grounds hallowed, sacred. And it's why, as you'll notice in this image here, that the building itself is elevated. In fact, on 18 13-foot pylons, such that the building itself never touches the grounds. What this does is open up the space, and you'll see an image a little bit later. But the building is also constructed in the manner that it is straightforward, unrhetorical, as Henry Cobb, who was the architect for the work, would describe it, so that the grandeur of the building would never be in competition with the grandeur of the story. And if you ever sort of think about museums and the ways in which they have been designed to appear somewhat larger than life in and of themselves, you can appreciate why this particular building, as beautiful as it may be, is constructed in the very straightforward manner it is. So our mission at the International African American Museum, or IAM as we affectionately refer to it, and I hope you're able to make your way if you haven't yet, is to honor the untold stories of the African American journey at one of our country's most sacred sites. And I've already described to you what that site was and why it is so incredibly important for us to do this work. However, we recognize that the overwhelming majority of the stories that we share, the narratives that we tell, the humanities that we uplift and elevate within the context of our work are not literally untold, not in most instances. So what we think about from an interpretive perspective is what it means for us to tell undertold stories, which is not a hard thing to do when contemplating the international African American journey. But in many instances, there are stories that have been told 1,000 times and perhaps haven't been done very well, that have not been contextualized within an African diasporic framing. And we're sort of making an argument that Charleston in and of itself is a diasporic city from its founding. I mean, well, it is, because it's primarily settled by Barbadian English planters and they're enslaved when they make their way between 1670 and 1671. But that the stories of the African American journey, the culture that becomes US African Americanness, doesn't exist, and neither does the rest of the diaspora, without the cultural cross-pollination and conversation that is both organic, the product of involuntary as well as voluntary movement, but also strategic. So I mentioned the raising of the building and the opportunity that it made available to us, and that was the African Ancestral Memorial Garden, designed by Walter Hood, who happens to be a MacArthur genius, but I think a genius if he'd never been mentioned by the MacArthur Foundation, would design alongside his team a body of gardens that comprise a single experience. And in this garden, every single floral selection is intentional. And what it is intended to do is to call on, to evoke, and to remind us of that triangulation of people and the movement of people, where they're coming and predominantly where they're going. So coming primarily from West and West Central Africa and making their way into the Western Hemisphere, whether thinking about Brazil through dune grasses or Charleston specifically and the port of Charleston as the entryway for no less than 40% of all African captives who would make their way presumptively into enslavement in perpetuity, into what becomes and what is the United States via the transatlantic slave trade, through our sweetgrass fields, the palm grove of Canary Island palms, which grow on and off the west coast of Africa. So you can begin to see and imagine, and you can see the palm grove here in the image, how these plants that just also happen to be quite hardy and friendly to this low country environment, are speaking to the ways in which the people were also connected. Additionally, there are installations, there are multiple ones, and I won't list all of them here, but you note the Tide tribute. Can everyone see it? I know you can, because it's like a big screen behind me. But foregrounded is the Tide tribute, and the Tide tribute is a fountain that mimics the ebb and flow of tide. Can anybody tell me what they see in that fountain? That's right. So the reliefs are designed to mimic the Brooks diagram. Anybody heard of the Brooks diagram? Yes, so it's this infamous, if not just very well-known, illustration of how African captives would have been placed in the bowels of a particular slave ship. But it was very much reflective of how Africans would have been positioned in the bowels of ships during that era. And because the fountain mimics the ebb and flow of tide, at high tide, those reliefs appear to be submerged at the bottoms of water, and that's because the Tide tribute is in memoriam to every man, woman, and child who was lost, making that voyage that we often refer to as the Middle Passage, and 1 in 4 do not survive. So we think about the African Ancestral Memorial Garden, as beautiful, as open as it is, primarily as a place for people, irrespective of their personal backgrounds, to come and sit, or perhaps to walk or to stroll, and to remember their ancestors. So exhibitions overview. Our second floor is the only interior interpretive space for the museum. And some might think one floor. I can tell you that the most frequent or common refrain from visitors is that they don't have enough time. I've actually run into folks that said, is this the end of the museum? But they've only completed the east wing. And I have to remind them that there's a whole other half to explore. But I understand because there are 11 core exhibitions that are shared between 9 permanent exhibition galleries, and they vary widely. Primarily thematically driven, meaning that my team has the capacity to play, and I do use the term play because we understand that the African American journey lives at the intersection, yes, of incredible trauma, but the people are not defined by trauma. The people are defined by choices and decisions, and they chose love, they chose resilience, they chose revolution, sometimes they chose joy. And so we play in the spaces of people, people's stories, place and time at any point from a local, national, or international or diasporic framing. And that's incredibly empowering because what it does is it offers to us the opportunity to really lean into the humanity of the story. Instead of flattening it with a timeline, we're able to elevate and add dimension, or really just to honor the dimension that's always been there. And we do this in South Carolina Connections, which you can sort of think about as a hall of fame, if you will, of African Americans of South Carolinian descent. Who have made national and international impact. Our Gullah Geechee Gallery, which I want to underscore, underline, bold, highlight, is truly a primer, an introduction to a living, breathing, and dynamic culture, the heart of which most folks would argue lives between Charleston and Savannah. But the practice and the culture itself, stretching as far north, unofficially as St. Augustine, North Carolina, officially Wilmington, North Carolina, and as far south as St. Augustine, Florida. African Roots and African Routes are two exhibitions, that live and are in conversation with each other in a single gallery. I always ask anyone to whom I'm offering a tour, and I have never been as fortunate as my educators to do this with young people, but before we opened, I would always say, and this is the question I will ask students, so I get to ask you, even though you've never been in these two places, but I know you're really smart, why might the two exhibitions, African Roots and African Routes, be in conversation with each other? There are no wrong answers. Everyone has not finished their coffee. You had to give it to the people at the front, didn't you? Say that one more time. Come on, brave one. Where you come from and where you're going are intricately intertwined. And that's an excellent answer. That's exactly right. And then we have Atlantic World, which we think about as an expansion in many respects. It's our single largest gallery of African routes, which of course speaks to and articulates the spaces and the places geographically that African people are finding themselves as a result of being captured and torn from their homelands in primarily in West and West Central Africa. Oh. And then we have Carolina Gold, Memories of the Enslaved, which are two exhibitions that also live in conversation with each other. And I want to note this because who knows the first major cash crop, the first one that begins to make a colonial America rich? Rice. Although when I ask most audiences, the answer, I mean, of course, this is the Charleston Library Conference, so I know y'all know what's up. But it's usually what? Cotton. It's usually cotton. And so again, rice isn't an untold story, but there's so much about rice as a story that hasn't been told. And so Carolina Gold presents us with this opportunity to tell it, and to tell it through the experience, through the genius, and the genesis of that economy as it relates to, and as a product of the brilliance, not just the bodily work and physical labor of those Africans who would build it. And then that brings me to American Journeys 1 and 2, and you'll see an image, a partial image of American Journeys 1 and 2 shortly. It is our only core exhibition that's married to timeline. It exists in 2 throughways and covers about 530 years, so have fun with that. And then there's Creative Journeys, and Creative Journeys is perhaps my favorite exhibition as a core exhibition goes, because it is completely non-didactic, and I don't feel like I have to explain that considering the room that I'm in. And so it is filled with primarily visual art and some literary art, but it becomes a completely non-didactic way of interpreting every single one of our core exhibitions. And it's creating sometimes visual disruption. In other instances, it's creating new conversations, but it really is this wonderful way for individuals to think about how they'll interact with the museum. And then there's Finding Family, which lives in our Center for Family History. So what does it mean to be an international African American museum in the southeast of the United States? We often say that the fact that we exist feels unlikely. And yet, because of what Charleston is, there could be no more perfect place in many respects for an international African American museum, certainly not in the United States. And so, one of the questions that I had to immediately ask myself, because there was quite a lot of conversation, quite a lot of discourse around critical race theory, particularly when I first arrived. And having come out of programs, and programming in museum work is typically centering education, or where a huge component of your work in public programs is education. And when we're thinking about education, it's K to 16, but there's a real focus on that sort of 3 to 12 age group. And I wanted to avoid CRT. You can laugh. Because that would seem impossible given the title of our museum. But as a former lawyer, I am incredibly confident that having utilized CRT for an entire year in research in law school, that there is virtually no third grade teacher that is using critical race theory in their classroom. Because it really is. It's a theory, it's a mechanism via which to interpret and to understand how laws, either inadvertently or intentionally, impact individuals, groups of people, and communities on the basis of race. That's what critical race theory is. It was designed for law students like myself, who almost 20 years ago were using it, and eventually expands for PhD students. I want to meet the 6th grade teacher. I want to meet them who's utilizing that theory in their American history course. That being said, I also understood as untrue, having used it, as its description was in the cultural zeitgeist, that it was very real with regard to how difficult it was increasingly becoming for teachers to talk about subjects that might make usually not the students, but often parents and community members uncomfortable. And my thought, as a Kamya, is there anybody that knows what Kamya means? Okay, so in Gullah Geechee, Kamya means that essentially you are a transplant. And if you're a Binya, it means that you've been here, that you are a native Charlestonian, you're a native person from the Low Country, and typically a member of that community. So as a Kamya, and not just a Kamya, as a Yankee Kamya, it was important to me to be very mindful about how I introduced the ideas of entering classrooms and guaranteeing or creating space for young people to make their way from schools and into our museum. In Detroit, which is my hometown, anybody from Michigan? Yay! Mitten love. There was a fantastic idea that was engaged by the Detroit Public School Community District. Lots of good things come out of Detroit. And what the district did was work to guarantee that every young person would visit a museum. And they had a body of funding that allowed them to do this. When I arrived here, I had a sneaking suspicion that that probably wouldn't be initiated, at least not as far as as a district making its way to IAM. So I reverse engineered the program, and we guaranteed visitorship and attendance for every 4th, 8th, and 11th grader if a district agreed to partner with us at the district level, removing the red tape that is often placed in front of teachers as well as schools just to get their students, irrespective of where they're going, out of the classroom and out into the world. We're really fortunate that we have 2 district partners, both Charleston County School District as well as Orangeburg County School District, and we're continuing to work with other districts to bring those young people. And part of how we were able to overcome that question to make ourselves less controversial and just more matter of fact is that we discussed ourselves as an institutional village partner. And we matched what it is that we offered to the curriculum of South Carolina schools. And we talked about what it would look like for the presence of those students to accelerate the goals, the academic goals of the districts. And so far, that's worked. We don't know how long it will continue to work, but what we do know is that within the first 4 months of the launch of the program, we saw over 6,000 students. Thank you. You can clap for us. We were very excited about that. And then there's our Center for Family History, and these are just 2 ways in which we are being very intentional, but 2 very different ways in which we're being quite intentional around building community. Our Center for Family History is our genealogy center. It offers a variety of opportunities, but one program in particular that I'm incredibly excited about is our IM History program. IM History is really it is museum driven, but it is a community centered effort, particularly around our older adults, particularly older African Americans throughout Greater Charleston. And essentially what we're working to do is support historic African-American institutions, particularly faith-based institutions, as well as families to begin to conserve and preserve their own archive. So we're offering the opportunity for that content to be digitized, creating space for oral histories, intergenerational familial oral histories to be conducted. And this is something that we've done several times. In many instances, we are allowed to collect and to digitize some of that material culture, which is so incredibly important because I am lucky enough to have not just 1, but 2 collecting teams, exhibitions, of course, and the collection, but also the archive for Center for Family History. And while everything that you can see in this image of our center is available and can be utilized for anyone, every visitor that arrives, when we collect, we do it with African-American genealogically relevant and resonant materials in mind. So the idea that we're able to help folks understand how to construct their obituary while also helping them to understand why it's so important to keep Uncle Pete's obituary is just one part and one element of that story, because when we are also allowed to acquire that material, it's helping us to build connectivity points for families, and we have actually seen it work. So it's just such exciting work because we're bringing people both literally but also figuratively together through a museum space. And museums are, we've been around for a while. And the modern construct of a museum is even still a couple hundred years old. But like libraries, we serve as one of the few bastions of public trust that the public trusts. So being able to think smartly about how we utilize that trust to also build new opportunities for truly untold stories to be known is an incredibly high priority for us. And so I thank you for taking the time to listen to me. I only saw one person get up, so I feel like I'm doing really good this morning. And now I just want to open it up for any questions that you might have about the work we're doing at IM.
We definitely have time for questions. So if you would like to come up to the mic and introduce yourself and tell where you're from, You're welcome to.
I know it's a long walk.
I'm from Maine. How did this museum coordinate the funding to make this come about? How many years of a journey was it?
23.
Wow.
23. And this is a good question. So like, I can make it long if you want me to, while somebody else decides if they want to ask a question. So yes, we're 23 years in the making, and that was as long a journey as it was in some ways miraculous in terms of the amount of time. The first person to say out loud that what the International African American Museum ultimately becomes, is former Charleston Mayor Joseph Riley. It's after he read a book, I believe it's Edward Ball's book about the domestic slave trade here in Charleston and the role of so many Charlestonians in the trade. And he felt compelled to do something about it. And in its first iteration, we were intended in many respects to fundamentally be a memoriam to the transatlantic slave trade and to the enslaved of Charleston and the greater Low Country. And that was immediately expanded. Fortunately, there was enough wisdom to understand that you needed to have a coalition around thinking something this big of an idea through. And our founding chair, Representative James Clyburn, was one of those first voices that insisted that we expand the story, that it couldn't just be about enslavement, it had to be about the people and what their lives were, not only after, but also before. And then through activations, through the likes of Charleston residents who also happen to have diasporic roots, like Miss Rhoda Green, who's originally from Barbados, who understood very much the Barbadian connection that to Charleston's founding, I should say, but also to its cultural evolution, right? We don't disconnect from our roots, we just grow from them. She, along with others, would bring this concept of us contemplating the museum as an international one. And with years and years of fundraising, and quite frankly, the kinds of connections that those sorts of individuals have, we eventually raised about $120 million to evolve this project.
Good morning, I'm Heather Staines from Delta Think. I'm one of the conference directors as well.
Hello.
What are you hearing from the kids, from those 6,000 kids that have gotten to visit? And I know you may not be directly involved in those tours, but what kind of feedback are the kids giving? Where are they spending the most time? What is their reaction to visiting the space?
Well, thank you for that question. So it varies. Some are as intentional. We actually had a group of young people, I believe they came from Greenville, and they were the only school group to visit the museum before we officially opened. Their teacher had written a grant to get busing to come to Charleston, and then we had to hold our opening. She wrote me a letter. And naturally, I said, yes, of course, we will figure out how we can bring your 60 babies from Greenville because you wrote a grant in order to get them their travel expenses covered. And of course, we welcomed them, as we do all South Carolina school groups, completely and totally free of charge. And they wrote us letters. Every single one of the children wrote us letters. And I read most of them. And several of them noted, and this was actually the one time I did talk to a school group, although I didn't tour them. And I mentioned that we used the term enslaved because it was a condition of the people, it was not what defined them. And so many of them wrote us back, saying that they didn't know that and that from now on they would say enslaved. It was something that was so impactful and important to them that they took that with them. And so that just supports one fact that several studies, and it's like every time somebody says several studies, it means it's really not a study, but I promise you there are, I just can't recall what it is, that notes even just a single proper museum visit expands vocabulary and the capacity of young people to be able to transfer knowledge to other topics. And so for me, that was one of those moments where I was like, ha, we did that. Another instance that was shared with me by our director for CFH, because in there, and you may have read this particular slide, and then there's the next one. But that one's cuter. So we'll go back, is a story booth. And our story booth is essentially sort of think StoryCorps, 2-minute audio or audio visual. It's usually about sharing a family story, but our visitors have hacked it and they'll just tell us how they feel about their experience at the museum. And there was one instance where a young person shared their experience. And what my director said is, based on this sound of the young person's voice and the comment, he presumed that they were one of the middle school visitors and that they were probably a young white boy. And what he said ostensibly was that after coming to the museum, everything that he'd been taught about Black people was a lie. So the opportunities for transformation are incredibly real. Some are going to tell us that they love the technology because there's a new museum. We've had the benefit of being able to lean into both immersive as well as interactive content. But for me, it's the media part. It's the elements that are shifting the way in which they're thinking about the stories that they're also learning and hearing when they leave the building. Thank you for that question.
Good morning. I'm
Morning.
Anna Carmichael from Gettysburg College. I'm particularly interested in the Genealogy Center and the ways that you are helping people of all ages figure out their own identity, how they fit personally into this bigger history. Could you talk a little bit more about the records that you're using, what's currently available, how you're finding additional material, and how you're building that space using those primary source documents?
Sure, thank you for that question. So our Center for Family History, as our Family Genealogy Center, does a few things. We have a digital presence, and I'll talk about that last. But on site, there are these 4 kiosks that you'll notice, and we use partners. One of our primary partners is Family Search. Many of you are probably very familiar with them. They are almost undoubtedly the largest holder or collector of genealogically relevant and resonant material culture, probably in the world, but without question in the United States. They have billions of records. So we utilize their resources and make those resources available in a really specific and special way when folks are in our space. And through our library affiliate relationship with Family Search, we're able to offer an additional 400 million records on top of those billions that are available, and that only exists for affiliate libraries with Family Search. We also facilitate courses, introduction to genealogy. Beyond that, we also utilize about a dozen other digital platforms that provide further resources to assist folks in their genealogy searches. That occurs in our gathering space, which is a little bit harder to detect via that image, but we use iPad, a smaller kiosk, where folks are able to spend more time. Now, when we are providing direct services, we may use any or all of those platforms in order to facilitate research. And then we also dig into our archive. So that includes USCT pensions. We're actually the second largest collector in the country. And USCT are United States Colored Troop Pension Records, which are this incredibly rich source material to support individuals once they've reached what we refer to as both the reality but also the myth of the brick wall of 1870. Is everyone familiar with that? That's fine, because it's more genealogical than it is sort of historical more writ large. And essentially, the brick wall of 1870 is the idea that African Americans have specific challenges moving beyond that point, because that's the first time that newly minted African Americans are appearing in mass in the US Census. And so we refer to it as a reality, but also a myth, because we know that the records are there. So we have special relationships, AKA contractors, who are also sort of genealogy research masters, who are working and partnering with us, with local records keepers, to pull and glean those records and to partner with us to actually digitize them so that we can make them available. But one of the really interesting pieces about African American genealogy in particular is that once you make your way into the antebellum period, where about 90% of all African people in the United States are enslaved, is that you're looking at records that you wouldn't necessarily expect when searching for people. So they're auction records, tax records, bills of sale. And one of the most incredible and really invaluable resources for those kinds of records are from the descendants of former enslavers, because those are personal records. Those are records that are public, but in many instances they are being held and kept in private collections. There's actually even a minor movement to acquire for others when they become available at auction, to acquire them in folks' own private collection. So making those available actually supports those African American families that are seeking fuller truths about their families. But one of the beauties of that program is, as our director for CFH often says, is that personal family histories are the pebbles that build the roads that we see so beautifully constructed and discussed in the larger museum, because personal history places us on the timeline. It tells us that we were there. Thank you for the question. Now that one feels most apropos. Thank you.